Hello, everybody. So we are getting to the last two topics of the semester. Here we're going to start with topic number 17, and we're going to discuss conservation and phylogenetics. So we are going to delve into conservation first, and then in the subsequent videos, we'll be talking about how phylogenetics and phylogenetic information on the tree of life is used to make conservation decisions. One thing to note about these phylogenetic methods is that they are still in their infancy, and so they haven't been used much yet. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is delve into some basic overviews of what conservation means, and then we will get into a little bit more of the details. So first, I wanted to introduce this beautiful animal on the introductory slide, Incilius peregrinis. This particular species was described in the 1960s, 1966 to be exact, and it was originally described in the genus Bufo, so it was Bufo peregrinis. It has since been moved out of that genus because systematists have reworked toads and toad systematics quite a bit. And so today toads are actually divided into many different genera. I believe there's at least 34 of them. And this particular species lived in parts of Costa Rica in some of the higher elevation cloud forest areas. What happened in 1988 is that biologists saw a drastic decline in the numbers of individuals of this particular species. Now, we've seen those patterns for a lot of different amphibians, but this one in particular was the first one that highlighted that there really was a problem. And so by the year 1989, this particular species, which is more commonly known as the golden toad, named for its beautiful color, had gone extinct. And since then, since 1989, we haven't found any new populations of this toad. This toad is often known as the poster child, or the very first of the amphibians that raised alarms about what was happening to amphibians. Today, we identify the entire problem, the amphibian decline problem, as the amphibian decline crisis. And a lot of that has to do with a fungus called chytrid fungus, which has been infecting amphibians all over the tropics and killing them in large numbers. But in addition to that, there are also human impacts that have caused the declines of some of these amphibian groups. So we'll talk a little bit about those impacts. We're not really going to talk about environmental biology per se. I do want to focus more on conservation and how conservation can be tied to phylogenetics. So we are going to talk a lot about conservation in terms of how we view conservation, and I want you to get used to using some of these terms like extinct, vulnerable, threatened. You will learn what those categories are. So let's get started with an overview of what you're going to learn in this topic. First, we'll talk about what conservation is. To you, conservation might mean something different than what it might mean to me, but we'll talk about some general definitions of what conservation might be. We'll also talk about the history of conservation very briefly. There's a lot of history that you can read. You can also read history about conservation as an idea that goes back many centuries to both Asia and Europe, but we're not going to talk about those. We'll also talk very briefly and very superficially about how conservation decisions get made. We won't, unfortunately, have time to talk about who gets to make those decisions, what is all the data that get used in order to make these decisions, and then finally we'll get to how phylogenetic information could be used to make conservation decisions. So I'm going to break this particular topic up into 2 or 3 videos. Please write down lots of notes. There are a couple of things that I will ask you to do and to bring to our group chat. So please bring this information with you. Let me quickly give you an overview. I'm going to ask you to do a little mini assignment. I want you to bring that to your group chat session with me. I'm also going to ask you to watch a couple of videos and look over a document that highlights the different criteria that we now use to place organisms in different categories of vulnerability. I will highlight these at the very end again. So the first thing I wanted to do, everybody, is to talk about conservation and preservation as two different terms that are often used interchangeably. Now, to you, conservation and preservation might not mean very different things. And in fact, when I started teaching this topic, I had no idea that there was a difference between the two. So I want to talk about this because the foundings and the origins of conservation and conservation biology very much depended on knowing these definitions. And the reason that I want to talk about these two terms is because they have a very large importance in terms of how the founders thought about conservation. So history of conservation and conservation biology very much depends on knowing the differences between these two. Conservation and preservation are still used today, but the people that use these different approaches think about species and their existence in the world very differently. So conservation is often viewed in terms of economic value. Conservationists today, modern conservationists, view the environment as having resources that we could use, thus giving it economic value, economic gain. And so we know that humans have certain needs. We require food, we require shelter, and then there are the other components to our life that are more luxurious perhaps, but hunting, mining, and logging are three very important economically driven industries that rely on natural resources. Our fossil fuels, for example, have to be extracted, and so those resources that man needs are economically valuable, and conservationists recognize this. If you compare that to the preservationist approach, preservationists assume that the environment has an intrinsic value. Just its existence provides value. Just being able to enjoy nature has value. And so preservationists often see conservation from much more of an ethical standpoint. We have a moral obligation as humans to preserve nature. Similarly, conservationists tend to agree that the environment should be used for resources that we might need and might be developed by humans. And if you look outside, we all live in some kind of neighborhood or some kind of area, whether it be rural or more suburban, where humans are living in shelters or structures that require natural resources. And so conservationists recognize this idea. Preservationists, on the other hand, suggest that the environment should remain unchanged, unmodified entirely. We shouldn't manage the environment, and it should remain unoccupied. This is a very different approach from conservation biologists, because preservationists have a let's not touch nature approach. Another difference here is that conservationists suggest typically that the environment should be managed. What that means is that man has a role in determining how the resources are used in a particular area. And so the idea is that we maximize the sustainable use of resources without depleting those resources. So there has to be oversight or regulation. And this is where the government comes in. We'll talk a little bit about the history of how that got started. Preservationists, on the other hand, believe that environment should just be enjoyed in its original form. The pure form in which nature exists should be enjoyed. We shouldn't have to go in and manage our environment or the land on which we live. As a quick little example, I have been working for a couple of years with a group called the Indiana Forest Alliance, and they believe in leaving some subsects or areas of Indiana's remaining deciduous forests as completely untouched. And part of the argument is that We want to maintain as much biodiversity in these areas as we can and simulate what nature would have looked like without man's influence. Conservationists, which are usually government agencies, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the USDA, the Department of Natural Resources, the DNR, those are all government-run agencies that focus on conservation, but they believe that we should be managing forests, which means that we should be able to control how much logging happens, but that we should allow logging to happen. So those are two very, very different things. The Indiana Forest Alliance, this group I've been working with, and the DNR are actually at odds, and so I often find myself struggling with trying to find my place in those areas. My goal is to understand insect diversity in Indiana's forests, and so I sometimes still struggle with my own ethical and moralistic views and how they relate to science. It can be actually really difficult to do. As an example of areas that have been undertaken by the government under a more conservation approach is national forests. We are allowed to log selectively and manage and otherwise use our national forests so that humans can benefit from them. We are allowed to go hunting in our national forests. We can have limited mining operations, perhaps, in or near those national forests. The areas in the United States that are preserved, that are purely preserved, that aren't managed, where it is illegal to collect specimens and conduct mining operations or hunt, or perhaps even fish, these are national parks. So those might help you understand the difference between today how we view conservation and preservation. I quickly wanted to talk a little bit about some of the important figures that have been involved in establishing conservation in the United States. Everybody should recognize the gentleman on the left, maybe not his face, but his name. That is Theodore or Teddy Roosevelt. And think about some of your background knowledge on U.S. history. Teddy Roosevelt was the 26th president of the United States, a Republican president at the time. And the gentleman on his right is a man by the name of John Muir. John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt were very good friends. And they are standing here in Yellowstone National Park, which is our very first established national park, thanks to John Muir, and also at the same time Teddy Roosevelt. So as a quick little overview, let me just quickly talk about John Muir. He's an important figure in our history of conservation biology. He is sometimes seen as the father of conservation as a whole in the United States. And he was the very first what we might call conservationist. But more so, he was a preservationist. He was the first to propose any kind of ethical idea about conservation of resources and nature. And he proposed that nature has intrinsic value. Nature being there in its current state has enough value. And he believed that its existence by itself should be enough. We don't have to use the resources in these particular areas. And as an example, the Yellowstone National Park. So he was very much anti-utilitarian, meaning let's not use the resources, let's preserve it in its purest state. Preserve it, meaning the area or areas that we're thinking of. He also argued that non-human species have a place in the world and that they're part of God's creation, and destroying or dismantling that whole idea would be a sin, right? His activism actually helped move forward a lot of different conservation projects and conservation areas in the United States. He was responsible for the preservation of the Yosemite Valley in California. He was also responsible for establishing Sequoia National Park, along with Yellowstone National Park, and he also helped establish what we today know as wilderness areas. Wilderness areas are protected areas where we leave nature alone. Those are very much preserved. Okay? In 1982, he became the founding president of the Sierra Club. And if you know anything about the Sierra Club, they are a very passionate group of people who care about preserving nature. If you go to the Sierra Club website, you will find that they are very much anti-utilitarian. Their goal has always been to preserve nature in its purest state. We sometimes now, in modern times, call those kinds of people environmentalists or environmental activists, but they are preservationists. Teddy Roosevelt became president in the very early 1900s, and he and John Muir were very good friends. But there was a big difference between Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir. Even though they were friends, Teddy Roosevelt had a little bit of a different approach to conservation. Now, what was happening at that time is that we were expanding outward to the west. And of course, as Americans at that time were founding a lot of cities, it also meant that they were using resources along the way to sustain themselves. So they were literally clear-cutting forests in order to start agriculture. They were using resources to the point where they were near depletion, if not entirely depleted. A lot of the places in our country today have actually undergone those same things. Much of Indiana used to be a deciduous forest. In fact, the entire state of Indiana used to be covered in forest, and now most of it is just agriculture. So imagine this happening on a large scale all across the western United States. And Teddy Roosevelt did not like this. So Teddy proposed, or he attempted to propose that there should be federal oversight, governmental oversight and regulation and management of natural areas in the United States. And that was mostly spurred on by his personal views that everything was being exploited. We were decimating natural lands and resources for human gain. So Teddy Roosevelt was responsible for establishing 5 national parks, a bunch of bird reserves, 51 at that time, several game reserves, and 150 national forests. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned that national forests today are managed by the Forest Service. While Teddy Roosevelt was in charge, he put another man by the name of Gifford Pinchot in charge of the newly founded U.S. Forest Service. Gifford Pinchot is the man on the left. And Gifford Pinchot really liked Teddy Roosevelt's ideas. You can read a little bit more about Gifford. He was a very interesting person, came from a very prominent and well-off, wealthy family. He studied for a while in France and came back with a lot of ideas for how the United States should manage its natural resources. So he and Teddy Roosevelt were very much aligned in terms of their philosophy. Now, today, those original ideas about management of natural resources so that we do not deplete those resources, so that we have sustainable practices, those are conservationist type approaches or conservationist type ideas or ideals. This shows you a picture of John Muir and Gifford Pinchot next to one another. These two men did not really have the same ideas in mind. In fact, John Muir often asked his friend Teddy Roosevelt to help him move certain things forward, but because Teddy Roosevelt had to look out for citizens as a whole, he tended to have to say no to John Muir and John Muir's requests. So a couple of different ideas that existed. Now you at least have an idea in your mind of how we view conservation today. Conservation involves the preservation of our natural resources, which might involve and often does involve management of those resources. Here's another picture for you of Roosevelt and Pinchot. And these two really valued each other as co-workers. I will send you a link I will post a link for you to read the history of the relationship between Teddy Roosevelt and Pinchot, just so that you can get an idea of how they worked together. One thing that I thought you all might enjoy is learning how conservation biology got started. Now, one thing that you might not know is that conservation biology as a discipline is really, really new. Conservation, while that idea existed for a long time, conservation biology as a field did not really come into play until the 1970s and 80s. And part of the reason was that after World War II, the United States and really the rest of the world was doing really well in terms of economic development. We were doing so well, in fact, that we were also very good at depleting our natural resources. And many, many different environmental catastrophes and disasters happened, which finally had people realize that something had to be done. And in 1978, there was a conference held that brought together various people who were interested in conservation biology and the issues that humans were facing or the environment was facing, and they met and essentially established what we today know as conservation biology. You know that you can study this. There are various programs across the United States, a lot of graduate programs that focus on conservation biology. And I quickly wanted to mention to you just how important conservation biology is in terms of the liberal arts. It helps to have a really good holistic approach to conservation biology. In fact, you can't have conservation biology without also having all these different components. First, you all, for the most part, are biologists, and we've got ecology, taxonomy, and genetics that play a really big role in conservation biology. You have to know where and how organisms live. That is ecology. And you have to know how ecosystems function. So think of the knowledge that you've gained in your time at Hanover and think about how you might be able to apply it to conservation biology. Knowledge of taxonomy is increasingly important in conservation biology because how we define species and perhaps even subspecies, that has grave consequences in terms of how we conserve organisms. Genetics is really important as well because it helps us understand how populations are evolving and how natural selection is affecting the genetic makeup of those organisms. If we know that there is a severe genetic bottleneck affecting organisms and that those organisms could be at risk of extinction, we can start to make plans, management plans to maintain those species. A good example of this might be the cheetah, which used to roam around much of Africa and is now restricted to very small parts of Africa due to a genetic bottleneck. And that was mostly due to hunting. Resource management is a really interesting field that involves forestry, fisheries, and wildlife management. If you really like resource management, you will likely end up working for the government, either in the U.S. Forestry Service or in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or for some management agency that functions underneath the government umbrella. Social sciences are also important. If you have knowledge about human psychology and how humans think, it often helps make certain conservation decisions a little bit easier or sometimes more difficult. There are populations and different tribal groups all around the world that have been affected by conservation decisions, right? If you live in a small tribe in Africa and there is an endangered species or a species nearing extinction living in the same place that you are living, there have been instances where you are forced to move or lose the resource that you need to eat or to sustain your tribe. So we can talk about that during our group chat. It's also important to have knowledge about sociology. How do humans think and how do they function in society? Because that is going to impact how you make conservation decisions. You also have to have a grasp of economics. Everything is about money, even if you think about things from a preservationist approach. In addition, geography is important. We will talk a little bit about how conservation biologists today view geography as a guideline to establishing conservation procedures and protocols. And then finally, the humanities. And one of you in this class is a humanities major. Humanities are really important for understanding the softer side of conservation biology. And by soft, I just mean the non-scientific side. If we're thinking about morals and ethics, this all falls into the humanities side of conservation biology. Anthropology is incredibly important because it helps us understand how humans and human civilizations are impacted by conservation decisions. History is important. If we didn't have historical knowledge of populations of organisms, or we didn't have historical data that we might need to make conservation decisions, that would make conservation biology quite difficult to do. We also know that history very much plays a role in how we make decisions today. We have made many mistakes when it comes to conservation biology. In addition, law is important. You can go into environmental law if you're really interested in that, where you get to work on the behalf of either environmental agencies or citizens. There are several really good movies that pertain to environmental law. In addition, politics is really, really important. The greatest impact that you all as young scientists and young citizens of the United States can have on conservation practice is to get involved in politics. This doesn't mean that you have to become a politician, but you have to, first off, vote. Vote for the people who stand for important conservation decisions. Vote for people who believe in sustainable practice. Vote for the people who really understand biology, right? And not just the economic point in conservation biology. Furthermore, we are all humans. Art and literature are very important in how we view the world. It is a way that we express ourselves. A lot of these original founders of conservation biology, which includes people like Pinchot and John Muir especially, and another man by the name of Aldo Leopold, those are all important people who got these movements going because they wrote about their experiences in nature. John Muir wrote about his experience living in and exploring Yellowstone National Park. They're full of beautiful stories that you can read. And if you think about the popular photography Ansel Adams, you all know his beautiful photography, his black and white photography. That is a form of expressing your love for conservation biology. And in fact, Ansel Adams' pictures has helped move preservationist biology forward. In fact, Ansel Adams was a member of the Sierra Club. So let's talk a little bit about what we conserve or preserve. And what you might want to do is pause a little bit and think about what is your prior knowledge, what are your prior conceived ideas before we get into some of the details. I encourage you to pause and think about your conception of conservation and how you might make decisions, just given what you've learned so far in your time at Hanover. So what I'm going to do really quickly is highlight a couple of different approaches to conservation. So first, there are species level approaches and broader approaches that focus on different scales in terms of conservation. The species approach focuses on conservation of individual species. And one thing that I want you all to learn today is that conservation is focused on species and any taxonomic level below that. So species, subspecies, populations, maybe varieties, and so on and so forth. Conservation is not focused on broader taxonomic levels, so orders, genera, families, phyla. Those are not ever considered under the umbrella of conservation biology. So the species approach is we have to conserve the area in which the species lives, or we have to find a way to prevent the species from going extinct. In addition, the species approach to conservation tends to focus on a couple of specific factors or features that makes conservation of that species a little bit easier. For example, it is much easier to convince the public or the government or whichever party you are trying to convince that you should preserve or conserve a species that is distinctive. So think of species that are charismatic, right? It is much easier to convince someone that they should conserve a bear than it is a little insect that lives somewhere in an obscure place on Earth. And that idea of focusing on megafauna is a big issue in conservation biology because people tend to gravitate toward and be attracted to larger animals, which typically includes mammals. Sometimes, as conservation biologists, there's also a focus on valuable species. Those are species that somehow are valuable to that particular culture or group of citizens. As an example, an organism that might be valuable, potentially economically valuable, it could be some kind of plant that is used for medicine. Something else that we tend to focus on as conservationists is also the organisms that are culturally significant. Think about what, as Americans, are culturally significant to us. The one organism that definitely comes to mind is the bald eagle. The bald eagle has cultural significance, historical significance to citizens of the United States, and so focusing on those kinds of organisms often helps move conservation efforts forward. And finally, probably the most important category that an organism should fall into when we're thinking about conservation is an organism that is somehow vulnerable. Vulnerable meaning that it is somewhere in a range of categories that puts it closer to risk of extinction. The entire idea, the whole idea of conservation is to prevent resources and species from either being depleted entirely or species from going extinct. If we fail at that, we are failing at conservation. So those are species-specific approaches. I also wanted to throw out a term that you might have heard before. These species that we tend to highlight as the faces of conservation efforts. Those might be species like the manatee, right? The bald eagle in the United States, bison, these large animals that are conspicuous, that are charismatic, that are purely American, if you think of it. Those species are sometimes called flagship species. They are species that have been selected in order to convince citizens, scientists, and other parties to focus conservation in those areas. The one negative thing there is that flagship species are not the only ones that are at risk of extinction, but it at least raises awareness for those species. Broader approaches, instead, are focused much more on the conservation of entire ecosystems or communities. So here, conservationists are rather interested in conserving an entire ecosystem that captures a variety of different species. So we are done with the first video related to conservation. In the next video, we will be talking about the species approaches a little bit more specifically. I will show you what kinds of areas we focus on in terms of broader conservation approaches, so those that focus on ecosystems or communities as a whole. And then we are also going to be discussing some of the categories that organisms can fall into so that we can make conservation decisions. So take a break, and I'll see you at the next video.